Well, good day, folks. John and I are coming to you today. It's been about a year since we've been under this lockdown, this crazy COVID weirdness that really hit us back in March when, they said 14 days to flatten the curve. And here we are, still this far into it, trying to find, some ground. India is getting just completely ravaged right now with another wave that's coming on. But here in the States, the vaccine's beginning to roll out, and there's this, normalcy, for whatever that word kind of means right now, seems to be coming back again. And there does seem to be an uncertainty, a little bit um, in all of our lives. What do we return to, whether it be work, school, family, but more importantly, especially a lot of what you and I talk about, John, is like, what does church look like, after COVID?
Well, absolutely. And you think, Brandon, about the different groups of people that might be listening to this podcast that are, out there, us included, is there's probably some folks that can resonate with, I can't wait to be back in the church sanctuary to sing without a mask on, to sing with a real music up front and to see people and to hug people. And then there's maybe another group of people that actually has kind of been okay not meeting, in the church building this year, that kind of enjoys staying in their PJs and maybe feels like they really haven't missed it all that much, being in person, that and maybe they've done online every week, maybe not. And then I think there's another group of church leaders and pastors that, in a sense, this is their bread and butter, this is their vocation. And there's a lot of uncertainty about how will we continue, who's coming back, do we just do things the way we used to do, which of course will be a temptation. So I think that's kind of the context we're in right now, and probably will be there for a little while.
Yeah, yeah, and today we thought about using a parable to kind of help us wrestle with this kind of idea, and it actually started in quite an interesting way. John, is that when COVID really got in full swing, the hospitals became overwhelmed with the amount of patients that were there, and not only that, just the protocol that was necessary in order to keep everyone safe from this particular virus, the amount of personal protective equipment that had to be go through, the masks and the garments and the gowns and all these types of things, and we were going through them, you know like no other. Every time somebody needed to enter into a room, to be with the patient, they'd have to strip of this, and it was in the garbage, and they'd have to put on new ones when they came in the next time. Well, I remember seeing a photo online, of a hospital that was dealing with this issue, and they had chosen, somebody came up with the bright idea, a nurse came up with the bright idea to he would have to go in and check the monitors, and all he was doing was simply filling out their, the clipboard with the things and just updating, and then he'd be walking out. No, nothing serious and routine, have to do it probably like every 15 to 20 minutes, but every time he walked into a new room, he had to change clothes, and a new pair of equipment, and it was just burning through money and time and so on. And so they came up with the idea to bring those monitors, extend the tubes on those monitors and the reach, and get them out into the hallways, where they could close the doors behind those monitors. And now people could just walk up and down the hallway and take the vitals and understand, write those down in the charts. And now they weren't wasting any protective equipment. And I remember just sharing this with you, about the innovation of our hospital people, our hospital workers at this time, and what they did in order to combat this particular problem. And it seemed to spark a lot in you, John, as you just kind of reflected on this thing and about the church, right?
Yeah, it became kind of a metaphor, or a parable or a symbol. And then that's that's kind of the way my brain works. It's it's a weird brain, but I immediately thought about the church as the hospital, and part of that comes from my own reflections, along with a lot of folks that have thought about the history of the church a little bit, and in the fact that that there was a movement in the scripture of moving, just like in the hospital, of moving things, out of everything taking place in a room into the hallways where there was activity and people walking and running, and so so where my mind went to, Brandon, is back in the Old Testament. In some ways, there was a room, right? There was first a tent, then a temple, but the room was where, quote, everything happened that was, divinely inspired. The offerings, the presence of God. There was something limiting about their ability to experience God outside of the room, outside of the temple. And so, but when Jesus came, in many ways, he lengthened the tubes. In other words, he certainly had a place in the synagogue. He did teach in the temple, but he spent the majority of his time out in the hallways of life for the Jewish people. And basically the location where he was became the room, if you want to use that analogy. And so the roads that he walked on, the mountain hillsides that he taught from, and then the early church, with the advantage of the Holy Spirit now living in them and not just Jesus, now all of a sudden there's no need to associate the presence of God with just one place, with just one priest, right, where everybody has to watch and be dependent on their intermediary, activity. So the early church grew and blossomed under the context, of not having a big building. They met in small homes and were able to, again, that's where life was already taking place for them. Meals were shared, people practiced hospitality, and then out in the workplace. But then what happened is that in some ways, everything got shoved back into the room and out of the hallways in the 4th century, under the leadership of the Emperor Constantine, who declared Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire. And when it became government sanctioned, Brandon, what happened is that the mode of doing church took on a particular Roman personality. And so the buildings that housed the church from that point on, the basilicas, they were all modeled. They took some liberties to do higher, lower, wider, that kind of thing. But essentially, the way that the buildings were structured, the role that they played in the weekly worship, the priests that were hired, to administer the worship, all in some ways, it all reverted back to the room, to the temple, the way that things had happened in the temple. And so that was a big setback, for the church.
Yeah. And it seems that we've continued to perpetuate this idea. That was back in 300 AD, and we're now sitting at 2021 here. And we have very much, thankfully not the same, we do have ornate buildings or whatnot, but there's still the same idea of temple worship. And so, John, what are the implications for us today as it relates to temple worship?
Well, I think, so this would be fun to explore together for just a couple minutes. But for me, one of the reality, put on the lenses, for example, of temple worship, and then begin to see, what we still associate the idea of once a week in a particular place that is somehow more holy, more God's presence is more there. We associate, maybe even by segregate the parts of our life into, that's my spiritual side, and then the rest of my life is not a place where God is just as present. Now we may theologically believe the Spirit lives in me now, the Spirit is everywhere, but the mode of the way we do church, I think, can reinforce, willingly or not, on the behalf of the pastors and the leaders, that this is where the action is. It's in the room. And so the reality, this would be, why, one of the questions I have is why have we continued to do it this way for these 16 centuries? What has kept us, from making a change? Have what runs through your mind, Brandon, when you think about that question?
There's from everything from the congregation itself, I think, even to leadership. I mean, I think temple worship to some degree has benefits in its ability to teach a wider audience, but at some points that falls off, and now we try to maintain the control or the power of being over that audience. It allows a congregant to release some of their own spiritual growth to the person behind the pulpit. You're now responsible for my spiritual growth rather than me.
You're the professional.
You're the one God chose, not me. I just come here to hear God speak through you. And so again, I think theologically we hold the idea of that we're all priests, but we've made, to some degree, we've made the one that is in ministry, the one who is somehow.
Well, you're making a great connection, Brandon, between the way we see our building is the way we design our leadership. and that affects the way people see themselves as participants, or are they just spectators, right? So that's part of, when I think about our consumer world. I would just add one thing to the good things you mentioned here, is just that the consumer world has taught me that I go somewhere, whether now it's online or whether it's Costco I go somewhere to get something. And so I think that's what pastors are fighting as well, is that when things are located in a building, people bring their consumer mindset, and so then it just helps perpetuate that. So the question I think we can end on for a few minutes here is, okay, so what would it look like if we extended the tubes, so to speak? If we don't dismiss the place of having a place to meet, but what if we extended the tubes? How might that help us in uh, getting after the purpose that we talk about often in Kingdom Story, of making disciples, of being people who grow to become more like Jesus, and to help others do that? So what might they, Brandon, you're involved in kind of rethinking the discipleship structure in your church. It has a building. Say a little bit about maybe the implications of this parable, for the work that your church is wanting to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of there's a perfect storm that's kind of come together that's really allowed us to take this question on more seriously. So I do admit to some degree that we have it a little easier than some others. But there's a quote that I might butcher a little bit, from Andrew Murray, that just says, the clearer the object of our pursuit, the more we are willing to adopt whatever means we will need in order to achieve that, right? And so, I mean, the goal for us, we've been really laying a foundation and a framework at our church to what's the goal? What are we doing? We are advancing the kingdom of God first in ourselves, our community, our families, communities around the world. Okay, well, how do we do that? And we're becoming very aware that if that's something we want to do, Sunday limits us. A 35-minute sermon on Sunday really limits our ability to see that mission unfold. And so we don't put emphasis on the building. We're putting emphasis on how do we achieve first advancing the kingdom in ourselves, as we're looking around at our congregation and seeing where are they struggling in that area first. And so I could get deep within that, but the building isn't limiting us in the sense, because the goal is what is our focus. And so I think, as we move forward in this, not only for our church, but also many others, is that the clearer your goal becomes, then you will find the right tool that'll achieve that. If the goal is to maintain the building, we're doing a bang up job at that. We are killing it. But if the goal is to make disciples, if the goal is to make people like Jesus, we've got to revisit our tools and see how they're helping us.
And, Brandon, you were sharing with me a story that illustrates what you're talking about, is how, so your church is on a piece of property, again, your church building, forgive
Right.
me, your church building is on a piece of property with an open lot next to it, and you're 2 blocks away from a middle school. And so you all did something, in other words, you extended your tubes outside of your building into that parking lot and did something kind of special in the last few weeks. Why don't you just give us, because it gives us a picture of how to think outside the room.
Yeah, we had originally earlier in the summer tried to do a movie night with the community, and it actually it went well. But for any of you those in Washington last year, realizing the fires that hit us at the time, we had to cancel, and then weather went south. But because of that, we were able to get connected with the local elementary school, and they wanted to partner with us in order to put on another movie night. And so a month ago, we have a large field right out beside our church. That's literally, there's no fences around it. Anybody can get there if you're just walking by. It's an open field, and we popped up a screen and a projector and put out to anybody, wide to the community. Here we got a children's movie. If you want to bring your family and come and just have some fellowship and fun and food and whatnot, we've got it covered. It's for free. Come and join us. And we were expecting about 100 people. And our pastor does not like to not have enough food. So he bought 160 hot dogs just to make sure he could cover the 100 people that were going to be there. and 225 people showed up, um, which caused him to have to run back to the store, which actually he was elated at that, knowing that the numbers just, exploded in such a way. But it was a way of us getting outside. There's no way many of those would have come
Oh,
inside the building.
well, you couldn't have fit them in there either.
Right, absolutely. Our building's not big enough for something like that. Um, but
And
yeah, had we thought,
I love the follow up. That the hearing that after John, after the event was over, John just being in the community ran into somebody driving by the church, or ran into somebody at the store who said, "Hey, I was at that event," and just, in other words, not only the parking lot, but getting out of the room in the community. Now he had a connecting point, and so his quote church life is now, yes, in the building still on Sunday, but that has released him to the parking lot, to the movie night, to connecting with people in the community. It's a great
yes,
example.
yes, absolutely. I mean, even another story of because John is a part-time, or works a full-time job as well, and he offices out of the church, so he's available, for stop bys. And a mother stopped by, and asked if her teenage child could use our building to do the Bible study that he had been teaching all summer, because it was getting too large and the
Hmm.
parents didn't want him doing it in homes because of COVID, and they needed more social distancing. And so this mother saw us there and comes in and says, "Hey, can my son use your building?" And so he uses our building on Tuesday nights to lead a Bible study that none of us are facilitating, but we're building relationship. But other than that,
Yeah.
this young man's love for Jesus that's brought him to do what he's doing.
Your story reminds me of our friend Matt Brolight, his book Out of the Fourth Place, when he talks about thinking through the way that we do church, like both in the room and in the hallways, that we can do our thing in our place, like that's Sunday morning having church. But then there's doing, their thing in our place. So the school wanted you to do a movie. It was their thing, but you did it in your place. And then the kids, same thing with the Bible study. They wanted to do their thing in your place.
Yep.
And so and then finding ways to do, like to do your thing. So maybe next time you want to have a church barbecue, but you have it in the park down the street instead of your fellowship hall. Now you're doing your thing in their place. And so it begins to mix up the room and the hallway in this kind of fluid, organic sense. And I think that's our hope as we move, quote unquote, back to normal, is that we would actually take a look at, I think of Winston Churchill's famous quote that we don't waste a good crisis, that somehow that this last year would rattle ourselves one step further into seeing how much of, Jesus lived his discipleship, witnessing salt and light life in the hallways, alongside the buildings. And so that's our hope as we move here, is that this will have inspired us to think outside of the room.
Yeah. Well, and I hope people hear us rightly in this, that there is a place for the building, and it
Absolutely.
fits within, the goal that we want to achieve in this, and to be ready to. We have a value in our church that says no sacred cows. And we're very aware and coming to a point that if the building becomes a sacred cow, then we got to do something about that.
Yep.
And so I offer that to all, and just saying that, we're not saying ditch the building, but find
No,
out
can you
where it really
imagine,
fits.
Brandon, if all the patients were in the hallways and didn't have their own rooms?
Right.
It'd be chaos. So you're right. We're advocating for a relationship between the two that aligns ourselves with becoming more and more like Jesus. And so that's maybe a good way to end, Brandon, is that we're grateful for this time. We hope you've been encouraged, and we don't have all the answers, Brandon, but we're just two disciples
Trying to find our place in God's story.